Karen spits on woman in Harris-Walz shirt, then learns she's a federal judge. The doors of the bustling coffee shop swung open as a woman in her mid-30s walked in, her face a picture of quiet confidence. She was dressed casually, her jeans and t-shirt slightly faded from wear. Her focus was entirely on the menu hanging behind the counter as she sifted through the options, taking a moment to figure out what she wanted. Just as she approached the counter, a loud, impatient voice broke the calm atmosphere. "Excuse me, you're not allowed to wear that here," came the sharp voice of a woman, clearly irritated. The woman at the counter, her hands still holding the menu, turned to face the source of the disruption. A woman, probably in her early 50s, stood a few feet away, her eyes narrowed with disdain. She was impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the more casual attire of the woman in front of her. The older woman, who clearly saw herself as someone of importance, pointed to the Biden-Harris shirt the younger woman was wearing. "I said, you're not allowed to wear that," the older woman repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is a public place, and we don't want any kind of politics interfering with the atmosphere. We have standards here." The younger woman, taken aback by the woman's aggressive tone, glanced around. Other patrons in the coffee shop seemed to be pretending not to notice, but Caitlin, the younger woman, could feel their eyes on her. She let out a quick breath, trying to stay composed, her thoughts racing as she tried to figure out the best way to respond. "I'm just here for a coffee," Caitlin replied calmly, attempting to ignore the woman's hostility. "There's no need to make a scene over my shirt." But the woman, evidently not one to be ignored, stepped forward, blocking Caitlin's path to the counter. She crossed her arms defiantly and leaned in, her voice dripping with judgment. "Oh, I think there is a need," she said, almost sneering. "What you're wearing isn't just a shirt, it's a statement. And frankly, we don't need that kind of divisiveness in here." Caitlin felt a flash of frustration rise in her chest. Her eyes darted toward the barista behind the counter, hoping for some support. But the young man was visibly uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the espresso machine. "This is a coffee shop, not a political rally," the woman continued. "We don't tolerate that kind of display here. I demand you take that off or leave." Caitlin blinked, momentarily stunned. This was a coffee shop, not a place where anyone should be treated this way. She hadn't come here to argue. She just wanted her coffee. But the woman wasn't letting up. "I'm not going to remove my shirt," Caitlin said, the calmness in her voice hiding the tension she felt. "It's just a shirt, and I'm not causing any harm to anyone." The woman scoffed, glancing around to see if anyone else shared her disapproval. "You are causing harm. By wearing that," she pointed to Caitlin's shirt, "you're making people uncomfortable. We don't want that kind of influence here." Caitlin, starting to feel both uncomfortable and angry, glanced toward the exit, wondering if it would be better to just walk out and avoid the confrontation. But something inside her resisted. She had the right to wear what she wanted, and she wasn't going to let some stranger tell her she couldn't. "I'm not breaking any rules by wearing this," Caitlin said firmly. "I'm just here to get a coffee. I'm not bothering anyone." The older woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a kind one. "Well, if you won't leave on your own, then I'll have to get the manager involved," she said, her voice carrying a sense of finality. "I won't stand for this in a public place." Caitlin's patience was wearing thin. She'd dealt with rude people before, but something about this woman's arrogance irked her in a way that no one else ever had. The woman was acting as though she had the right to dictate what others could or could not wear based on her personal beliefs. Caitlin knew she couldn't just back down. "Go ahead," Caitlin said, standing her ground. "I'm not leaving." The older woman's eyes narrowed, and Caitlin could see the wheels turning in her head. She was going to make this a scene, wasn't she? The woman stepped back and pulled out her phone, no doubt preparing to make a call. As she did, Caitlin's eyes briefly scanned the coffee shop, noticing the various patrons watching the exchange with curiosity. She was feeling more and more like an outsider in this moment, her right to exist peacefully in a public space being challenged by someone who seemed to think they had the authority to enforce their beliefs on everyone around them. The older woman dialed the number with quick, decisive movements, holding the phone up to her ear as she walked toward the counter. "Yes, I need to speak to the manager," she said loudly, her voice carrying over the hum of conversation in the shop. "There's a woman here wearing an inappropriate political shirt. I need her removed immediately." Caitlin's jaw clenched. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, her fists clenching at her sides. This wasn't about the shirt anymore. This was about the principle of it, the right to exist as who she was without having to apologize for it, without being told she was making others uncomfortable. As the woman continued her call, Caitlin stood, waiting. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew she wouldn't back down. She wasn't going to leave, not without her coffee. And then, just as she was steeling herself for the confrontation that was sure to follow, the manager, a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt, emerged from the back room. He looked between the two women, clearly not knowing the full context of what was happening. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking directly at Caitlin. Before she could respond, the older woman was already speaking, her voice sharp. "Yes, there is. This woman refuses to remove her political shirt, and it's disrupting the entire atmosphere of this establishment. I demand she leave immediately." Caitlin held her ground, a calm expression on her face despite the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly, her voice firm. "I haven't broken any rules. I just came in for a coffee." The manager looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the situation. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Let's calm down here. Let me get this sorted." The older woman smiled triumphantly, but Caitlin could tell it was far from over. Something was about to happen, something Caitlin had no control over. Caitlin felt the eyes of the entire coffee shop on her as the manager stood between her and the older woman, who had been loudly complaining for the past few minutes. He seemed to be assessing the situation, his eyes flicking between Caitlin and the woman, trying to make sense of what was happening. She could see that he was trying to keep the peace, but something about the way he held himself made it clear that he didn't fully understand the dynamics at play. The older woman had stopped talking for a moment, waiting for the manager to take charge of the situation. Her arms were crossed, her face tight with frustration. Caitlin could see the way her posture was rigid, as if she had already decided the outcome of this encounter. The manager, on the other hand, seemed torn between appeasing the customer and doing what was right. After a few seconds of silence, the manager turned to Caitlin. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The other customers are becoming uncomfortable, and we don't want to escalate this any further." His tone was polite but firm, though Caitlin could hear a hint of uncertainty behind his words. He was clearly trying to avoid confrontation, but the words he spoke felt like a blow to Caitlin's resolve. For a moment, Caitlin felt her heart race. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She wasn't even causing a scene. She had just been standing there, minding her own business. It was the older woman who had started the conflict, not her. She could feel a tight knot of anger forming in her chest, but she pushed it down, reminding herself that the situation was about to escalate even further. "I'm not leaving," Caitlin said, her voice steady but filled with frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong. This woman is the one who's causing the disturbance." The manager's gaze faltered for a moment. "I understand your frustration, but we need to make sure the environment here remains comfortable for everyone." Caitlin's blood began to boil. She had heard this excuse so many times before, for everyone's comfort. She couldn't help but wonder if the manager would have taken the same approach if she were wearing a different shirt, one with a more neutral design. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had to handle this situation. "You're allowing her to dictate how I dress?" Caitlin asked, her voice growing louder now, though she was careful to keep it controlled. "You're going to throw me out because of a shirt?" The older woman stepped in, her face flushed with anger. "Yes, you are creating an uncomfortable environment, and it's unacceptable. People like you think they can just push their agenda on everyone else. Not here, not in my presence." Caitlin's fists clenched at her sides, but she kept herself composed, determined not to let this woman get under her skin any further. "My agenda is to wear a shirt that represents my beliefs, just as you're clearly representing yours by attacking me. I don't tell you what to wear, and I expect the same respect in return." The older woman's face twisted with disdain. "You're unbelievable," she hissed. "I've had enough of this. I'm calling security." Before Caitlin could respond, the older woman pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Caitlin could feel her body tense as she prepared herself for whatever would come next. She had been patient, but now her nerves were starting to fray. How had things escalated so quickly? How had she ended up in this position, trying to defend herself for simply existing in a public space? She glanced at the manager, who was standing silently beside her, watching the woman angrily make her phone call. He hadn't said anything for a while, and his silence only made Caitlin feel more alienated. Why wasn't he standing up for her? Why wasn't he taking control of the situation? "Excuse me," the manager finally said, breaking the tension. "I'll need to ask you both to step aside while we sort this out." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "No," she said sharply, "I won't step aside. I'm not letting someone like this walk around, making a spectacle of herself. The people in this shop deserve better." Caitlin was growing more frustrated by the second, but she wasn't going to back down. The older woman had crossed a line, and Caitlin wasn't about to let her bully her into submission. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply worn a shirt that represented her beliefs, something that every person had the right to do in this country. The tension was building, and Caitlin could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her. Some were watching with curiosity, while others tried to avoid looking, pretending that nothing was happening. Caitlin realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just a personal confrontation. It had become something bigger, a battle for her right to exist and express herself without fear of judgment. The manager, noticing the situation spiraling out of control, tried again to intervene. "We don't want to cause any more trouble," he said, his voice quieter now, as though hoping to calm the situation. "Please, let's try to keep things civil." But Caitlin wasn't interested in keeping things civil anymore. The woman in front of her had made it clear that she wasn't going to let Caitlin have a voice, and Caitlin had had enough of being silenced. The manager was being too passive, trying to please both sides, but sometimes that wasn't possible. "I'm not leaving," Caitlin said again, her voice stronger this time. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to let her dictate my rights." The older woman sneered. "You're delusional if you think you can just do whatever you want in here. This is my space, and I will not tolerate your kind here." Caitlin didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let this woman push her around. She was standing her ground, no matter how much the woman tried to tear her down. As the seconds dragged on, Caitlin realized she had no choice but to stay and face whatever would come next. She had made her stand, and now she had to follow through. The woman was calling security, the manager was no help, and all she had left was her own determination to not be silenced. But deep down, Caitlin knew that she was at a crossroads. This wasn't just a simple disagreement anymore. This was a test, and she had to prove that she wouldn't back down. The older woman was relentless. She had her phone to her ear now, speaking loudly, her voice rising above the quiet hum of the coffee shop. Caitlin could hear her words clearly. "There's a woman here wearing a Kamala Harris shirt, and I want her removed immediately. She's creating an uncomfortable environment." Caitlin felt a fire light inside of her. She wouldn't let herself be treated like this. She wouldn't let this woman decide what she could wear, how she could express herself. "I'm not leaving," Caitlin repeated one last time, her voice calm but resolute. The tension in the coffee shop was palpable, almost thick enough to cut with a knife. Caitlin stood her ground, her hands trembling at her sides, but her jaw set firmly. The older woman, whose name she didn't know but whose disdain she could feel radiating off of her, continued speaking into her phone, the volume of her voice rising with each passing second. It was as if she were trying to command the atmosphere, to force Caitlin into submission with her sheer force of will. Caitlin took a slow, steadying breath. She wasn't going to back down. The situation felt unreal, but it was happening, right in front of her. This wasn't just a debate about a shirt or an opinion. It had morphed into something bigger, something about the right to exist in public without being condemned for something as simple as personal choice. As the woman continued her tirade into the phone, Caitlin couldn't help but notice how the other customers had started to turn their attention toward them. A few people exchanged quiet glances, their eyes flicking between the two women. Caitlin could almost hear their unspoken judgments. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others were pretending not to notice, but she knew they were all watching, waiting to see how this would play out. The woman on the phone paused for a moment, as if waiting for someone on the other end to speak. Caitlin felt her stomach knot. This was escalating, and she was sure that it was going to get much worse before it got better. But there was something else, a sense of disbelief mixed with determination. She was not going to be intimidated. She was not going to let this woman or anyone else dictate how she should express herself. As if sensing Caitlin's unyielding stance, the woman finally ended her call, putting the phone down with an exaggerated sigh. She looked directly at Caitlin, a smug smirk on her face. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave again," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I've already called security, and they'll be here any minute." Caitlin's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her pulse quicken. This wasn't just about her shirt anymore. This woman had made up her mind about Caitlin, about who she was based on something as simple as her clothing. The shirt wasn't just a piece of fabric to her. It was a symbol of everything the woman disapproved of, and now she was using that as an excuse to make Caitlin feel like she didn't belong in this space. "I'm not leaving," Caitlin repeated, this time more forcefully, stepping closer to the counter, her chin tilted upward. "You don't get to tell me what to wear. I'm not bothering anyone. I'm here for coffee, just like everyone else." The older woman's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. "I don't care what you think. You're making people uncomfortable, and that's not something I'm going to let slide. You're in my space now, and I'm not letting you ruin it for everyone else." At this point, Caitlin was done with trying to reason. She could see the stubbornness in the woman's eyes, the refusal to even entertain the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. It wasn't just about the shirt anymore. It was about Caitlin's very existence in the space. She could feel the fire of defiance rising within her. She had a right to be here, just as much as anyone else. The manager, Daniel, had been standing to the side, watching everything unfold. He hadn't said much up until now, his face a mixture of unease and uncertainty. Caitlin noticed him shift on his feet, but he didn't approach her or the woman, choosing instead to remain passive. It was obvious now that he was just trying to keep the peace, but his silence only made the situation worse. If anything, it gave the older woman more room to press her demands. "You're going to have to leave, or I'll have you escorted out by security," the woman spat. "You don't belong here, and you never should have been allowed in the first place." Caitlin stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her mind. How could this be happening? Why did this woman feel the need to be so hostile, so vile? Simply because Caitlin wore a shirt with Kamala Harris's name on it. She wasn't the one in the wrong here, yet here she was being told she didn't belong. "I'm not leaving," Caitlin said once again, her voice a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. "I came in here to get a coffee, and I'm not going anywhere. You're the one who's causing a scene." The older woman clenched her fists, and Caitlin saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. The woman was beyond angry now. She was almost trembling with rage. "You think you can just walk around here wearing whatever you want and not face any consequences?" she sneered. "This isn't some free-for-all. You're in my world now. People like you are the reason this country is in such a mess." "People like me?" Caitlin repeated, taken aback by the woman's words. "You don't even know me, and yet you're judging me for what? A shirt? A simple piece of clothing? Your shirt represents everything I hate." The woman spat back, her face red with anger. "You're nothing but a political pawn, trying to force your agenda on everyone else. I won't stand for it." Caitlin felt a flash of fury, but she controlled it. She couldn't lose her composure now. "You don't get to dictate what people wear," Caitlin shot back, her voice calm but steely. "You don't get to make decisions for everyone just because you don't like something. I have as much of a right to be here as anyone else, and I'm not leaving until I'm ready." At this, the older woman sneered. "Fine," she hissed. "I'll make sure you leave. Just wait until security gets here." As the minutes dragged on, Caitlin realized that no matter how much she stood her ground, this woman wasn't going to change. She wasn't interested in compromise or understanding. She just wanted to win. She just wanted to prove that she could control the situation no matter what. Caitlin glanced over at the counter again, seeing the barista avoid her gaze, no doubt hoping this would all just go away. She felt utterly alone, standing in this moment, fighting for her right to exist in public without being judged or harassed for a shirt she chose to wear. And yet, despite everything, Caitlin wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. No matter what this woman said, Caitlin wasn't going to back down. She had the right to express herself, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially this stranger, take that from her. The silence in the coffee shop was thick, heavy with tension as Caitlin stood her ground. The older woman was still staring at her, the look on her face a mixture of contempt and superiority. Caitlin could feel the weight of the woman's gaze, like she was trying to break her down with nothing more than sheer force of will. But Caitlin wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't going to give in. The manager, Daniel, still hadn't intervened in any meaningful way. Caitlin couldn't understand why he wasn't doing more to de-escalate the situation. It was as if he was frozen in place, too afraid to make a decision that might upset one of the customers, even if that customer was wrong. Caitlin's frustration with him was growing. She had expected more from the person in charge, but now it was clear that he was just another bystander. The older woman huffed impatiently, tapping her foot. "I'm not going to wait around for this nonsense to go on any longer," she snapped, her voice loud enough for everyone in the shop to hear. "I'll make sure you're escorted out, one way or another." Caitlin stood tall, her expression firm. She wasn't going to let this woman bully her, no matter how much the woman tried to make her feel like an intruder in this space. She had the right to be here just like everyone else. It didn't matter what her shirt represented. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. What mattered was that she wasn't doing anything wrong. "I'm not causing any trouble," Caitlin said, her voice calm but laced with a firm resolve. "I'm not bothering anyone. I came in here to get my coffee and mind my own business. But if you continue to make a scene, you're the one causing trouble, not me." The older woman's face reddened with anger. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she spat, stepping forward as if she was going to invade Caitlin's personal space. "You think you're better than me because of that shirt? Well, you're wrong. You don't get to dictate how people should feel or what they should tolerate." Caitlin's jaw clenched, but she refused to let the woman's words affect her. This was no longer about the shirt. This was about the woman's need to feel superior, to exert control over Caitlin and everyone around her. It was about power, and Caitlin wasn't going to let her take it. "I'm not asking for anyone's approval," Caitlin said, her voice steady despite the rising anger. "I'm just here to exist, like everyone else. You're the one trying to make a scene, not me. And I'm not leaving. You'll leave when I say you leave," the woman hissed, her face now inches away from Caitlin's. "I'm not going to let people like you walk all over this place. You have no right to come in here and flaunt your political agenda." Caitlin could feel her body tense, but she didn't back away. The woman's words were like a slap in the face, but Caitlin wasn't going to let her show any weakness. She stood there, unmoving, refusing to let the woman intimidate her any further. "I'm not here to flaunt anything," Caitlin said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable. I'm just wearing a shirt. That's it. But you're the one causing all of this. You're the one who's trying to turn something as simple as clothing into an issue." The older woman sneered, but Caitlin could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For a split second, it seemed as though the woman was weighing her options, trying to decide whether to keep pushing or let it go. But the moment passed quickly, and the woman stepped back, her eyes still locked on Caitlin. "You'll regret this," the woman said with a sneer. "I'll make sure the manager knows what you've done. You'll never be welcome here again." Caitlin felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she didn't flinch. This woman could make all the threats she wanted, but Caitlin wasn't going to be intimidated. She wasn't going to let anyone tell her where she could or couldn't be based on what she wore. The manager, Daniel, finally stepped forward, his voice hesitant. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, but Caitlin could hear the uncertainty in his tone. He wasn't taking control of the situation, and it was clear that he was waiting for the older woman to tell him what to do. "Everything is far from okay," the woman replied, her voice dripping with venom. "This girl," she gestured toward Caitlin, "is causing a scene with her shirt. I've asked her to leave, and she refuses. She's disrespecting everyone in here. I demand that she be removed from this establishment immediately." Daniel's eyes flicked to Caitlin, then back to the woman. He opened his mouth, but Caitlin cut him off. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't about the shirt. This is about you trying to tell me what I can and can't wear. And I won't stand for it." The woman's eyes narrowed in anger. "You will leave, and you will do it quietly. Or I'll make sure you never set foot in this shop again." Caitlin's gaze never wavered. She wasn't backing down, no matter how much the woman tried to make her feel small. She stood tall, her back straight, and her hands at her sides. She wasn't going to let this woman push her around any longer. "You can make all the threats you want," Caitlin said, her voice cutting through the tension. "But I'm not leaving. I have as much right to be here as anyone else. I'm not doing anything wrong, and I'm not going anywhere." The woman's face twisted in fury, but Caitlin could see that her confidence was starting to crack. She had expected Caitlin to back down, to apologize, to leave without a fight. But Caitlin wasn't giving her that satisfaction. The woman had underestimated her, and now she was losing control of the situation. "I don't care what you think," the woman said, her voice shaking with rage. "You're not welcome here, and I'll make sure you regret this." Caitlin didn't flinch. She wasn't intimidated by the woman's anger, nor was she going to let her have the last word. She knew that this wasn't about right or wrong anymore. This was about power, and Caitlin wasn't going to let this woman take it from her. As the woman fumed in front of her, Caitlin stood tall, unwavering, her resolve solidifying with every passing moment. She wasn't going anywhere, and she wasn't going to be forced out of a space where she had every right to be. Caitlin stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, every fiber of her being screaming to hold her ground. The older woman's eyes were wild with rage, her arms trembling at her sides as she seethed. The words that had come out of her mouth had only made the situation worse, but Caitlin wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The woman's threats had become hollow, but they didn't stop her from pushing, from trying to escalate the conflict further. It was as though she believed she could bend Caitlin's will, make her feel small, like she was the one in the wrong. Caitlin had seen this kind of attitude before. People who felt entitled to impose their views on others because they thought they had the power to do so. But Caitlin wasn't going to let her have that power. "I told you before, I'm not leaving," Caitlin repeated, her voice unwavering. "I don't care what you think of my shirt. I don't care if you're uncomfortable. This is my right to be here." The woman's face twisted in disgust. "You think you have rights?" she scoffed. "People like you ruin this country, and it's people like me who have to clean up your mess." Caitlin didn't flinch, though every word felt like a slap to the face. She had seen this type of entitlement before, the kind that believed their personal discomfort was more important than anyone else's freedom to exist. It was frustrating, but she wasn't going to let herself become emotionally entangled in it. She had to stay strong. "I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable," Caitlin said firmly. "I'm just wearing a shirt. You're the one causing this problem, not me." The older woman took a step closer, her voice getting louder with every word. "No, you're the problem," she hissed, her hands shaking. "You think you can walk in here and display your agenda like this is some kind of free-for-all? Well, it's not. And I won't let people like you ruin the atmosphere." Caitlin could feel the anger bubbling in her chest, but she took another deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about the shirt anymore. It was about standing up for her right to exist without someone dictating how she should live, how she should express herself. She had every right to be here just like anyone else, and she wasn't going to let this woman take that away from her. "I'm not asking for your approval," Caitlin said, her voice growing more confident. "But I'm not going to leave just because you don't like what I'm wearing." The older woman clenched her fists, her knuckles white with anger. "You're just as bad as the rest of them," she spat. All you people think you can walk around and make everyone else bend to your will. Well, I won't let that happen in here." At this point, Caitlin was done. She had listened to enough. This woman wasn't just being rude. She was being downright malicious, trying to bully Caitlin into submission, trying to make her feel as though she didn't have a place in the world. The more Caitlin thought about it, the more infuriating it became. The woman was the one causing a scene, and now Caitlin was being blamed for it. "I'm not backing down," Caitlin said, her voice firm and resolute. "You're the one making a scene, not me. I'm here for coffee. I'm not bothering anyone, but you're making sure everyone knows about this. And for what? Because of a shirt?" The woman's expression twisted in disgust. "You don't belong here," she sneered. "You're just a political pawn, a walking, talking symbol of everything wrong with this country. You should be ashamed of yourself." Caitlin felt her blood boil, but she kept her composure. This woman wasn't going to get the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She wasn't going to let her control the narrative. "You don't get to decide who belongs here," Caitlin shot back. "This is a public place. I'm a customer just like everyone else. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let you tell me that I don't have a right to exist." The woman took another step closer, her face flushed with anger. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," she growled. "You'll regret this, I promise." But just as the tension reached a breaking point, a voice broke through the chaos. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from a man who had just entered the coffee shop. He was tall, dressed casually in a jacket and slacks, with an air of authority about him that immediately caught Caitlin's attention. He seemed unfazed by the tension in the room, his gaze sweeping over the situation with practiced eyes. The older woman immediately turned toward him, her expression shifting from one of anger to one of relief. "Yes," she said quickly, "this woman is causing a scene. She refuses to leave, and she's wearing a shirt that makes everyone uncomfortable. I demand that she be removed from the premises." The man's eyes flicked to Caitlin, then back to the woman. "And what's wrong with her shirt?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of authority that demanded respect. The older woman didn't hesitate. "It's political. It's a blatant statement, and it's causing a disturbance. She's making everyone uncomfortable. You need to do something about this." The man looked back at Caitlin, who stood her ground. He could tell she wasn't backing down, and something about her calm composure seemed to make him take notice. He wasn't buying into the woman's hysteria. "I don't see a problem," he said, his voice steady. "This is a public place. She's not breaking any rules. You're the one who's creating the disturbance." The older woman's eyes widened, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What?" she sputtered. "You're letting her get away with this? You can't just let people walk in here and push their political views on everyone else." The man shook his head, his gaze cold. "I'm not letting anyone push anything. But what I am going to do is make sure you understand that your personal discomfort doesn't override someone else's right to be here. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're the one who should leave." Caitlin felt a wave of relief wash over her. The man wasn't backing the older woman up. He wasn't buying into her narrative. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Caitlin felt like she was being heard. "You don't get to tell people how to dress, and you certainly don't get to tell them where they can go based on their clothing choices." The man continued, his tone unyielding. "If you don't like it, that's your problem. But it's not Caitlin's. She's not the one causing trouble here." The older woman stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. She had no comeback, no retort that could undo what had just been said. The man had taken control of the situation, and she had no choice but to retreat. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the man said firmly, turning his gaze back to her. "You've created enough of a scene already." Without another word, the older woman turned and stormed out of the coffee shop, her heels clicking loudly on the floor as she made her way to the door. Caitlin watched her go, her heart still pounding but her mind finally starting to settle. And as she looked back at the man, who was now offering her a slight smile, Caitlin realized she hadn't just won a small victory. She had reclaimed her right to exist in public without apology. And that, for her, was everything. The older woman stormed out of the coffee shop, her footsteps echoing in the now silent room. Caitlin watched her go, still standing tall, her breathing slow and steady, feeling the tension in her chest start to subside. The manager, the man who had intervened, was still standing nearby, his eyes locked onto the door where the woman had just exited. He took a few seconds to compose himself before looking back at Caitlin, his expression serious but calm. "You handled yourself well in there," the manager said, his voice low. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Caitlin nodded, grateful for his support, but her mind was still racing. She wasn't sure why she'd had to fight so hard just to be treated fairly, or why the older woman had escalated things to the point of calling her a disruption. It made no sense to her, but what was clearer now than ever before was the reality of how people could judge and dismiss others based on the smallest things, like a shirt. But as much as she was frustrated with the situation, she couldn't allow herself to feel defeated. This wasn't just about standing up for her shirt or her beliefs. It was about not allowing anyone to make her feel small. "I don't understand," Caitlin began, turning her gaze to the manager. Why did she have to make it into something so personal? It was just a shirt, the manager sighed, glancing down at the counter, visibly trying to choose his words carefully. Sometimes people have difficulty with things they don't understand. For whatever reason, your shirt became a symbol to her. And for people like that, it's not about the shirt. It's about making sure others conform to what they believe is right. It's a power thing. Caitlin nodded, her frustration still bubbling under the surface. "I get that, but it doesn't make it right. I shouldn't have to explain myself for wearing a shirt. I'm just existing." And it's infuriating that she thought she had the right to dictate that to me. The manager looked at her with a touch of empathy, though his expression remained neutral. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that, but you're not alone. People come in here all the time with different opinions and beliefs, and as long as they're not causing a disturbance, they're free to express themselves." Caitlin took a deep breath, trying to let the words sink in. It wasn't so much about the shirt anymore, and she knew it. It was about something bigger, something more insidious. People didn't just lash out because of a shirt. They lashed out because of the fear of change, of differing views, of people who were brave enough to stand up for what they believed in. People like the older woman had to make themselves feel powerful by suppressing others, by claiming ownership of spaces and making others feel unwelcome. "Thank you for stepping in," Caitlin said, her voice softer now. "I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't." The manager gave a slight nod, acknowledging her words but still clearly troubled. "I don't think this is over. People like her don't just walk away from things like this. They'll make sure it's a fight, even if they have to pick another battle. And I've seen it before."
Caitlin raised an eyebrow, her mind shifting gears as she tried to understand where the manager was coming from. She was still processing everything that had happened.
"What do you mean by that?"
Before he could respond, the door to the coffee shop opened again, and Caitlin's heart dropped as she saw the older woman standing at the threshold, her arms crossed and her face contorted with pure disdain. Behind her, the faint outline of a police officer appeared, his uniform barely visible but unmistakable. Caitlin didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let this woman dictate how she should behave any longer. She had already made her stance clear. She had every right to be here, and she wasn't going to allow the older woman to make her feel otherwise. "What's this?" Caitlin asked, her voice steady, but with a tinge of disbelief. "You called the cops?" The older woman stepped into the coffee shop, her eyes locked onto Caitlin as if she were about to take her down with a single glare. The police officer, a tall man with a stern face, remained by the door, seemingly waiting for instructions. "This is a disturbance," the woman said, her voice cold and sharp. "This woman here is refusing to leave after being asked to. She's a troublemaker and I want her removed." Caitlin's pulse quickened. She didn't expect this escalation, but she was ready. Her eyes remained fixed on the older woman as she took a deep breath. She wouldn't let the situation spiral out of control again. "You've got to be kidding me," Caitlin said, her words cutting through the tension. "I'm not leaving. I've done nothing wrong." The police officer turned his gaze to the manager, who looked helpless but didn't offer any resistance. The manager's expression was unreadable, But it was clear he didn't want to escalate things further either. The older woman continued to stare at Caitlin, waiting for a response, but Caitlin refused to break. "This is ridiculous," Caitlin continued, her voice rising just slightly. "You're calling the police because I wore a shirt?" The police officer spoke, his voice neutral but firm. "Ma'am, I'm just here to ensure things don't escalate further. I'll need you to step outside while I sort this out." The words stung. Caitlin felt as if she were being painted as the villain in this situation when she knew she wasn't the one causing trouble. She wasn't the one making demands. She wasn't the one trying to control how others behaved. "Are you serious?" Caitlin shot back. "You're siding with her? She's the one causing a scene, not me." The officer seemed momentarily caught off guard by Caitlin's defiance. He glanced at the older woman, then at the manager, who remained quiet. Caitlin could feel the eyes of the other customers on her now, but she wasn't about to back down. The woman had crossed a line. "You're not the problem here," the officer said, but his words felt hollow. "But we're going to have to ask you to leave for now while we sort this out." The older woman smirked triumphantly, but Caitlin could see the cracks in her facade. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Caitlin stood her ground, unwavering as the police officer and the older woman locked eyes. She could feel the weight of the stares from the other customers in the coffee shop, but she refused to let that intimidate her. Her palms were slightly sweaty, but her voice was firm. "You can't just make me leave because of a shirt," Caitlin said, her tone still calm, but filled with righteous indignation. "This is ridiculous." The police officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet, looking from Caitlin to the woman who had called him. He could tell that Caitlin wasn't going to give in, but it wasn't his decision to make. He was here to ensure there were no further issues, but he was beginning to question whether he was being dragged into something unnecessary. "I'm just following orders, ma'am," the officer said. "But I need you to step outside. You've caused a disturbance, and the management doesn't want things to escalate." Caitlin could feel her blood boil. She wasn't causing a disturbance. She was just standing up for herself. The woman, the one who was trying to control everything, was the real cause of all this chaos. Caitlin's mind raced, trying to find the right words to convey how absurd the situation was, but she knew that the officer wasn't going to listen. His focus was on the woman who had called him, not on the reality of what was happening. She had seen this before. People in power often turned a blind eye to injustice when it came from someone they trusted. "I'm not leaving," Caitlin said again, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer's face remained neutral, but Caitlin could see the tension in his posture. It was clear that he didn't want to get further involved, but the older woman's persistent attitude left him little choice. She had demanded his presence, and he couldn't very well ignore it. But Caitlin wasn't going to make it easy for them. She wasn't backing down. The woman, emboldened by the officer's presence, stepped forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can just walk around like this? Spreading your disgusting agenda?" She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowed. "I don't want people like you in here. I won't stand for it." Caitlin could feel the rage building inside of her, but she refused to let it show. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about her right to stand in this coffee shop, her right to wear whatever she wanted, without being harassed or judged for it. The woman had no right to decide who belonged here and who didn't. Caitlin wasn't going to let her get away with it. "You don't get to decide that," Caitlin said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "This isn't your place. You can't tell people they don't belong just because they wear something you don't like. That's not how this works." The woman's eyes flashed with anger. "You're ruining this place. You're ruining everything with your politics," she spat, her voice rising. "I won't let you destroy what I've built." "I'm not ruining anything," Caitlin retorted. "You're the one making a scene. You're the one who's trying to control me, trying to force me to leave because of a shirt. This is not your world to dictate." The officer stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. "Ma'am, please," he said, his voice tentative. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave if you don't comply." The woman turned on him, her expression venomous. "You're siding with her?" she demanded, jabbing a finger at Caitlin. "She's the one causing all the problems, and you're just going to let her walk away?" But the officer wasn't listening anymore. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm done with this. You've caused enough trouble for today. You need to leave." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but the officer cut her off. "You're not getting another chance to make things worse," he said, his tone firm. "If you don't leave now, I'll have to escort you out." The older woman's face went pale. She had been so sure of her power in this situation, so certain that her demands would be met, but now she was losing control. Her authority, her influence, crumbling in front of her. Caitlin had stood her ground, refused to back down, and now she was watching this woman falter. "Get out," the officer said again, this time with more force. The woman's lips trembled with fury, but there was nothing she could do. With a final, venomous glare at Caitlin, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the coffee shop, her pride shattered. In this intense showdown, Caitlin didn't just stand her ground. She shattered the notion that anyone can be silenced or bullied into conformity. The older woman, blinded by her narrow view, tried to impose her discomfort on Caitlin, but Caitlin refused to be intimidated. She didn't back down, even when things escalated and the situation became more heated. This is a reminder that, no matter the situation, we can all stand up for what's right, especially when we're being unfairly judged or pushed out. The power to remain calm and assertive, even under pressure, is something we can all take with us. Let's not let anyone make us feel small or lesser for expressing who we are. What Caitlin showed us today is that the world can be a lot more equal when we stand firm and demand our space, without apology. What would you do in a similar situation? Share your thoughts below.